Eli and Rodger of the Skies was the first Hollywood feature film to bear Steven Spielberg's name. But most people have never even heard of it, much less seen it, and there's a reason for that. When 20th Century Fox released it in theaters in 1973, the film had been so badly recut by the studio that no less than the director, the screenwriter, and the producers would all have their names taken off it. Steven Spielberg was so appalled by the movie that he hoped the studio would bury it. And it looks like they did, because Eli and Rodger of the Skies has never been officially released onto VHS or DVD and Blu-ray. It shows up on television every now and then, but that's about it. What went wrong? How did a movie with so much talent attached get butchered by its own studio? I recently watched the movie for the first time, and it inspired me to reach out to the filmmakers for some answers. So in this video, you'll hear about how Eli and Rodger of the Skies was first developed as an original story idea by Steven Spielberg. You'll also hear about the film's production and the chaos which descended on it during post-production, when 20th Century Fox took the movie away from the filmmakers and disastrously tried to edit it themselves, resulting in a movie which no one was happy with. The story begins in the mid to late 1960s, when Steven Spielberg was studying at Long Beach State. It was there that he met a young screenwriter named Claudia Salter, who had been dating a fraternity brother of Spielberg's named Ian. During this time, Spielberg was making frequent trips to Universal Studios, where, among other things, he had been thrown off the set of Alfred Hitchcock's Torn Curtain. Desperate to find some way of breaking into the movie industry, Spielberg tried to convince Claudia Salter and her boyfriend to join him in applying for an internship working for Hitchcock, but they weren't interested. In 1966, Claudia Salter sold two screenplays to Universal. One was entitled Malcolm Winkler, and the other was entitled A Wooden Nickel. Spielberg took an interest in directing A Wooden Nickel, but he was only 20 years old at the time and no one would hire him. By 1969, Spielberg was directing episodic television at Universal, but he had yet to direct a feature film. Through agent Mike Medavoy, he met comedy writer Carl Gottlieb, who was developing a World War I flying movie with Robert Altman entitled The Chicken and the Hawk. When it never got made, Spielberg and Gottlieb got together and tried to pitch their own World War I flying movie to Warner Brothers, but the deal fell through because Warner Brothers wasn't keen on Spielberg directing the film. One of Spielberg's friends, filmmaker Tony Bill, had been interested in the idea of a barnstorming movie. Intrigued by this, Spielberg got together with Claudia Salter, who had always wanted to tell a father-son story, and it was through the combination of these two concepts that the idea for Eli and Rodger of the Skies was born. Spielberg advised Salter to write the screenplay by imagining every scene at night. Salter recalls that Spielberg's gift was making everyone look like a genius. And when the screenplay for Eli was finally finished, Spielberg sent it to 20th Century Fox president Richard D. Zanuck. Zanuck liked the script and wanted to buy it, but Spielberg's agent, Guy McIlvaine, informed him that one condition of the deal was for Zanuck to meet with Spielberg, who wanted to direct it himself. Spielberg met with Zanuck as well as David Brown, who was then the executive vice president of creative operations. At the meeting, Zanuck and Brown bought the Eli script from Spielberg for $50,000, but they declined to let Spielberg direct the film because they thought he was too young and inexperienced. However, on January 6, 1970, after Zanuck and Brown had left the studio, Fox announced that Spielberg would direct Eli, with Joe Wison producing. Shooting was scheduled for that summer, and Academy Award winner Cliff Robertson, who was a pilot in real life, was cast in the role of Eli. But when producers Robert Fryer and James Cresson took over the project, everything changed. They'd had a bad experience with the young British director Michael Sarn on the film Myra Breckenridge, which provoked Robert Fryer to declare, "I don't want any directors under 35 ever again." So instead of letting Spielberg direct Eli as initially planned, Fryer and Cresson decided to hire John Erman, who got the job because he was older than Spielberg, and because he had impressed the producers with his film Making It. What attracted Erman to the Eli screenplay was the opportunity to direct a film which would be a psychological study of failure. Eli and Rodger of the Skies went into production in Hutchinson, Kansas in the summer of 1971. John Erman recalls that he enjoyed directing the film, though it was not without its setbacks. As far as the cast was concerned, Erman enjoyed working with Eric Shea, who plays Rodger, and with Pamela Franklin, who plays a flapper in the film. However, Erman found Cliff Robertson difficult to work with. By this point in his career, Robertson was an alcoholic who insisted on always wearing dark makeup to make himself look younger. One day on the set, when Eric Shea accidentally hurt his hand during a take and wept afterwards, Robertson muttered, "If you were my son, you wouldn't cry." There was another day of shooting when second unit director Tom Schmidt approached Erman to inform him of a more unusual problem. When Erman said, "Tom, I don't want to hear about anything unless Bernadette Peters has crashed in the plane," Schmidt replied that that was exactly what had happened. Fortunately, Peters wasn't hurt in the crash. By the way, one of the extras in this sequence was a young Joe Hanrahan, who would later go on to be one of the finest actors in the Midwest. When production wrapped, a musical score was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, whom John Erman loved working with. Also, the film originally ended with the Eli character so overcome with misery at the realization that Rodger is smarter than he is, that Eli jumps out of his plane and commits suicide. Then, in the final scene, an orphaned Rodger calls up his aunt, presumably to go and live with her. However, when the film was shown to Gordon Stuhlberg, who had replaced Richard Zanuck as president of 20th Century Fox, Stuhlberg decided that he wasn't interested in the dark nature of the film and decided to have it re-edited to be more like the Reavers, with happier music and a happier ending. Producer Robert Fryer protested, but Stuhlberg's mind was made up. The film was subsequently shelved for 2 years. At one point, it was reportedly given an X rating for swearing, and much of the foul language was cut out. Also, the studio wanted parts of Jerry Goldsmith's score to be replaced with something more upbeat, so they brought in songwriter Jim Grady, who'd been under contract with 20th Century Fox Records. Executive Russ Reagan believed that one of Grady's songs, Who's For Complainin', would fit both the beginning and ending credits of the film. Conductor Lionel Newman had quipped, "What kind of title is Who's For Complaining? Sounds like Who's Fornicating." Grady's song is fun, relaxing, and makes for easy listening, but using it in a film as dark and as sad as Ace Eli causes the film to have some bizarre tonal shifts. For example, in the opening credits, we go from those merry images of Eli and his wife flying around in the sky, and then immediately to that horrific sequence where Eli crashes the plane into the barn, killing his wife right in front of their traumatized son. This sets a jarring, unpleasant tone over the rest of the film because we're not sure if it's meant to be a comedy or a drama. Thus, we're unsure how we're supposed to feel about the story. And then there's the problem of the ending. The film was recut so that instead of ending with Eli committing suicide, it ends with Eli and Rodger returning home together. But this doesn't make any sense, because in the previous scene, we've just seen Eli coldly reject Rodger's declarations of love, so what's the point of Eli suddenly flying up into the sky and abandoning Rodger in this scene if it's not to kill himself? Eli behaves so cruelly throughout the whole film that his character arc practically requires him to die at the end. But if he's still alive at the end, then the story no longer serves a dramatic purpose. The film, in this form, sort of has a happy ending, but it's a completely meaningless happy ending because there's no indication that Eli has redeemed himself. He's presumably going to keep being the same terrible father to Rodger that he's always been. So, in a way, you could argue that this fake happy ending is actually more pessimistic than the initial tragic ending. Upset with the changes the studio had made to the movie, several of the filmmakers decided to have their names taken off it. Producers Robert Fryer and James Cresson had their names replaced with a single pseudonym, the non-existent Boris Wilson. Claudia Salter had her name replaced with Chips Rosen, which is an anagram for censorship. John Erman wanted his name replaced with Norman Maine, but when the studio realized he was referencing the suicidal character from A Star Is Born, they told him, stop screwing around and choose another name, so he instead had his name replaced with Bill Sampson, as a reference to a character in All About Eve who was corrupted by Hollywood. Some of the filmmakers kept their names on the movie, including cinematographer David M. Walsh, as well as Spielberg, who got a story by credit. When the film was finally released in the spring of 1973, Spielberg recalls, "I was the only person that kept their name on the screen, and I only kept my name on the screen because nobody told me they were taking their names off the screen. So I wound up going to a theater, seeing the movie, and seeing suddenly 6 names I'd never heard of before, and then recognizing my own and realizing everybody had jumped ship and didn't tell me it was sinking." Disgusted with the changes the studio had made, Spielberg publicly charged that his story had been turned into a really sick film. They should bury it. Despite all of these issues, I personally find Eli and Rodger of the Skies to be a fascinating film on many levels. For one thing, there are some good scenes in it. For example, I like the scene where Eli tells Rodger how his own father once promised him a pony to ride and disappointed him by bringing home a billy goat instead, daring him to ride it. This scene works because it gives us a clue as to why Eli is so abusive towards his own son. In another one of the film's better scenes, a boy named Dumb Dicky, played by Robert Hamm, waits all day to get a chance to ride in Eli's plane, but instead of letting him ride, Eli ditches him to ride off with the Bernadette Peters character instead. This scene works because it makes us feel sorry for this kid, and it once again demonstrates Eli's mean-spirited insensitivity. In scenes like these, you can sense the original vision for the film, what might have been. Even though the studio was the one who butchered Ace Eli, the movie industry blamed John Erman for the film's failure. He was dropped by his agents, and he didn't work for 2 years. Then he met with the legendary George Cukor for lunch, and Cukor asked him, "What are you doing now?" Erman hated the idea of having to go back and direct episodic television, but Cukor advised him to ask for whatever job he could get. Cukor himself had once been fired from Gone with the Wind, yet he was still able to find directing work afterwards, explaining, "It's how you know you've survived the worst thing that can possibly happen to a director, so you never have to be frightened again." Erman took Cukor's advice, and eventually he was back to directing quality work. Among his later directing credits were the television show Roots and the TV movies In Early Frost, Who Will Love My Children, A Streetcar Named Desire, The Two Mrs. Grenvilles, and Our Sons. Songwriter Jim Grady went on to write the book Stolen, which is all about his adventures in the music industry. Screenwriter Claudia Salter reunited with Steven Spielberg in the 1990s on a project for Amblin Entertainment entitled The Realm, which she had been developing with producer Andrea McCall. She would also go on to write the scripts for the TV movies Running Mates and Man in the Mirror, the Michael Jackson story. As for Steven Spielberg, well, we all know what happened to him. And although Eli and Rodger of the Skies is a mere footnote in his career, it is, in my opinion, an important footnote nevertheless. The film is flawed, but it's a lesson in the consequences of studio recutting and how crucial it is for studios to allow filmmakers to make the movies they want to make. And hey, for all I know, maybe there are people out there who enjoy Eli and Rodger of the Skies exactly the way it is. So that's all the more reason why I believe an official home video release is now in order. Even though the movie didn't turn out the way Spielberg wanted, he has since mentioned that even if he had known then what he knows now about its production, he probably still would have kept his name on it. Because, in his own words, having a real credit in those days was a hoot, and it was something to be proud of. For more information about the making of Eli and Rodger of the Skies, check out Steven Spielberg, A Biography by Joseph McBride, and Steven Spielberg and Duel, The Making of a Film Career by Stephen Awalt.